Welcome back, and this will be our last video for JavaScript, and we're going to talk about enhancing and validating forms and the values that you receive from them, so building on the last video. Let's take a look. So we're going to use JavaScript to reference forms and different form elements. We're going to retrieve values from different items such as lists and buttons. We're going to learn to format numeric values and currency values based on whatever standard we're looking at. We are going to write some scripts that respond to form events and store values in hidden fields so our users can't see them. We're going to understand how web forms are submitted for validation. We're going to learn to validate web form fields using some different customizable tools. We're going to learn to test a field value against a regular expression. We're going to create customized validation checks for example, like for credit card data. And then finally, we're going to look at how we manage the form validation process. So for example, we're going to be using this Kaltura traditional cooking for the modern age website. Again, all of the code for this is available in the GitHub repository for the class. But let's take a look at what we have here. So up at the top under product order, we've got a model field where it is a pull down and it is the model of the product. Next to it, we have a quantity field, again, which is a pull down. We have the model cost field, which is going to be a display only to our user. So it'll take the cost of the model, multiply it by the quantity, and display it here. Over on the left, we've got radio buttons or option buttons, and we're going to call this plan field. And then here we have plan cost. And again, whichever one you choose here is going to change the result of what cost is here. We've got a few additional fields, and these are very similar to what we had in our CBC. So we've got a subtotal, a sales tax, and a total cost. And then finally down here at the button, we have an add to cart. Now on the left here, we're going to display some information depending upon what we choose as our model. So here we chose the 6-quart, and it's showing the multifunctional pressure cooker. The forms collection in JavaScript is going to be its own collection, and we are going to be able to reference it by using our document.forms. And so our syntax for referencing, if we say n is an index and f name is the value of the attribute name. So when we look at that ID name, we can refer to document.forms of n, which is the index. We can say document.forms f name, so we can give it the name of the attribute in that index position in the array notation. Or we can refer to it just directly by using its name, document.forms.fname. In these three examples, the n, the f name in the second and third, they're all going to change based on which element you're looking at. Working with the form elements, they're going to be organized into a special collection called form.elements. When we want to reference fields, if we say ename is going to be the name attribute of the field, we say form.elements, give it the array notation with the square brackets and the name attribute of what the field you're referencing. Or we can ditch the square brackets and say form.elements.ename. In this syntax, what's going to change is the word form because it's italicized and ename. So whatever your form variable name is called is going to be where it says form. The dot elements is what stays the same. And then you're going to have a dot and then whatever field you're referencing. We can also reference the associated control, which it would be that name attribute, by doing the get element by ID. That is it's the same that we've been doing all along with our HTML by saying get element by ID and sending it that name attribute. we do have an input element. So let's look at some of the properties and methods associated to it. So every attribute associated within the input tag is mirrored by a JavaScript property. So a sample statement, let's set the value of the username field within the order form web form to give it a value. So that is basically taking text and putting it into the text field, say as suggestive text or starter text. In order to do that, we would say document dot form. So our form is named order form. So it's document dot order form dot e field. So our field is username. So here we have dot username, and we're going to give it the value dot value of quote John Smith. So we're taking the text John Smith, inserting it into the value in the username field in my order form within this web page. So you can kind of read it going right to left. Input controls, a form control receives focus when it becomes active. So if a user is to click in a text box, that focus then becomes active in that text box. You've probably witnessed this when you've clicked in it and all of a sudden, it kind of gives it control. So what we can do is, in order to give focus to an element, we can say element.focus. So if, for example, you click a radio button, you want to automatically, say, go to the next element, we can say element.focus on the element after we click on it. Now here, in order to remove focus, we blur. So in the words in English, focus and blur are kind of opposites. So here we say we give it focus in order to make it the main one available and visible, and we say blur to remove the focus from that element. Here we've got some form hierarchy. On the left, we've got that DOM model that we had talked about in the last lecture video. So here we've got our window and our document, and within our document we've got several different forms. Then we also have elements that are out here, and within these elements we do have options. So say this element 0 here, if it has different options, it's going to be either, say, a pull down text box or a radio button, but it's going to be some type of element that has a selection that happens within it. Now here on the right, we've got a little bit of code going on, and we've got a window.add event listener, right? That is going to do something when something happens. So the first something is on load. So it's going to run a function when the page loads. Now this is using that anonymous function, which I'm not a fan of, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway, because to me, you lose a little bit of track of who goes where and what parentheses and curly brackets and all that kind of good stuff, and semicolons. So I'm not a fan of using the anonymous function, but it's here, so we're going to look at it. So basically, instead of using a function name, they use the word function, and then they just define their function within these curly brackets that start here at the top and they end here at the bottom. This function is going to reference the order form and reference the model. So let order form, which is defining our variable order form, and it's going to be the document.forms.order form. Here we've got let model equal the order forms element model. So it's going to reference the selection list in the order form. Here, what we're going to do when the form opens, we're going to give focus model.focus to the selection list. So that is going to be what's highlighted and ready to go right when the page loads. So here on the green on load. Working with selection lists. So we are able to return the value from the selection list by using an index. It indexes the choices listed in the selection list field just as if they were in an array. So they start at 0 and they go up to however many items you have in your selection list. We can get the new number of which one is chosen by using this selected index property. If nothing is chosen, it will return a -1. So we can then reference the value property of the selected option in order to get what the user chose. So the user chooses the second value down. You're going to do get selected index. It's going to give you the index of 1 because we start at 0. So the second one down is going to be 1. And then we can say dot value, and it's going to give us the actual text of what's in there. So some sample code. The M index is going to be the selected index. And then the value is going to be model.options. Options are going to be all of the values that are in that selection field. So I want the one at the index I selected, M index, and then I get the value by saying dot value. You can have a selection list with multiple values. All you'll have to do is go through a for loop and checking whether the selected property is true. That is that truthy, falsy thing. So if I'm saying here, M index, get selected index, I can say if M index, then do something. That means something was chosen. It is a 0 or above. It's a positive number. It doesn't return that negative. If M index comes back as false, that means that nothing was selected on that one. Here we've got a lot of great selection list properties and methods. They will look very close to what we use in an array. So we've got the length, so the number of options in that pull down. We've got multiple if we can select multiple. We've got the name, which is the field name. We've got the options. We've got the selected index. We've got the size. And the size is going to be the number of options displayed in the selection list. Don't get size and length confused. Okay. The other one we have is add, and then we have a remove. So if you want to remove an element once a user chooses it, we have the ability to do that. And we also have the ability to add options on the fly. Some more options that we have: default selected. So once your page loads, if you want to default to either a blank or an NA or a specific value, we can do a default selected. We do have the index, which is the number. The selected is a true false value, whether the user has selected that item or not. We have text, which is the text associated, and then we have value, which is the field value. Let's take a look at some example code with our example problem from before. So this code is going to directly be related to that top line here where I have the model field, the quantity field, and then the cost of the model. I said previously that that cost is going to be the model cost times the quantity. So keep that in mind as we go forward. So here, function calculate the order. What we're going to do is determine the selected model, which is going to be this model field, the first pull down. So get selected index, get the value, and that's going to retrieve the value of the selected model. Next, we need to determine how many they chose in this pull down. So we do the same thing, get selected index, selected index, and then value, elements by value. Okay, so that's going to retrieve the number of that they had selected in the quantity field. Finally, in order to calculate what goes in this model cost, we're going to take the quantity field, which is here, and multiply it by the value, which is what we got here. Then we're going to set the value of this field to be what we just calculated. So order form dot elements model cost value is equal to model cost. That is going to put then so for example, the 129.95 times 1. So in this field, it's going to put the 129.95. Now, option buttons are a little different. Option buttons, radio buttons, however you call them. That is a group in JavaScript. So what we're going to do is we're going to group it into a form.elements.options collection where they're all going to share the same name attribute, okay? And in this case, the form is going to change and the options are going to change, okay? So sample reference to option, to reference the first option button for a plan field. So document.forms.order form elements plan of 0, because we start at 0. Well, things that we can do with these radio buttons, option buttons, we can see if it's checked by using checked. We can give it a default, whether we want it to be checked or not. We can actually disable it, and we can give it a name, and we can give it a value. So for the check option, we have a sample for loop here that is going to store the value of whatever is selected into a new variable called plan value. So thinking back to the original, and we'll look at it again, there were some plans that you can choose, kind of like those extra warranty plans. So here, let my order form equal the order form. My plan is going to be the elements called plan. I'm going to go through that loop from 0 to however long my plan is. And if that plan is checked, we look at that plan as if it is an array. I'm going to say that my plan value is going to be equal to the value of whatever is checked. Once I find it, I'm going to use that break and just like hop out of that for loop. Down here, we've got a sample that uses query selector method to retrieve the checked options value. So here it's a little different. It's going to say, go into my plan and my order form, my element, and get what is checked. So query selector, which is basically mean go in and get me where the input name is plan and what is checked, and then get me, return me that value. This is a little bit more confusing to me. It's a little bit easier if you know, say, SQL or something of that nature, but not necessarily just for the, normal programmer. Here is more example code and the graphic of the order section of that web page that we had looked at originally. So let's first look up here on the right. And let's see that first we're going to charge the plan to each item ordered. Why are those the same? Let's take a look at that product order form that we've been looking at. So first up here, what I can do is I'm going to add some information. So this is the end of what we did prior. And here we're going to retrieve the cost of the protection plan. So let plan, and it's using that query selector, the one I don't like, but that's okay. So we want to know which one is checked, and we want the value of it. So here the value is 0, 11.95, 15.95, and 19.95. Okay, so just getting which one of these has the radio button checked, the blue. Then we're going to charge the plan to each item ordered. So each one of these plans is per quantity. Now we already did get the quantity previous when we looked at the code. So let's just say the plan cost is equal to the plan value times the quantity. Then we're going to set the value of this text box right here. Cost of the protection plan, we're going to say order form elements, the plan cost, which is that one right there, equals what we just calculated as plan cost. Then we're going to come down here to this bottom left, and we're going to update the rest of these text boxes. So here we're going to calculate this order subtotal, which is going to be the plan cost plus the model cost. We just add those two together. Then we set this subtotal value to what we just calculated. Then we're going to calculate the sales tax. So we're going to take that subtotal and multiply it by 0.05 for 5%. We're going to set the value of this text box to that value. And then finally, we're going to calculate the total cost. So subtotal plus tax, and then we're going to set that value. Now, one thing to notice right now is check out the number of significant digits on the right-hand side of the decimal point. So here we've got 129.95 because that's what we had here, and then that times 0 is 0. 0 plus 129.95 is 129.95. But then when I take this and multiply it by 0.05, I now get 4 significant digits, which gives me 4 significant digits for the total. So let's maybe take a look at how we can fix that. The text associated with those radio buttons or option buttons, we call that a label. And the label tag is not part of the input tag. So the label is associated with the input control through its for attribute, which is going to be the same as the input that matches the ID attribute. So if we want to see what's in that input, we say input.labels. Okay, so let's look at an example. It'll make much more sense. So no protection, get element by ID, plan sub 0. That's the element ID that we want. Once we have that, we can say that the label is equal to whatever element that is dot labels. Okay, and that's where we can get what that text says. We use that labels just as we do the array. So if I want the plan at 0, I'm going to look at the label at 0, but then I can add that dot text content. That is going to give me the text that is associated with that option button or radio button and what is displayed to the user. If we want to retrieve the label text for the selected one, what we can say is the plan is going to be the one that is checked, or you can do your for loop. And then you can say whatever one is selected, labels sub 0 text content. Okay, so this one is to get it out of the full listing. So this right here would be the no protection, the index 0, index 1, 2, 3, all of them. This one down here gets whichever one's checked. The HTML code in a label, we retrieve it by using that inner HTML property. We've used that before to set some values that we're displaying. If we want to format that data in a form, we do have something called toFixed, and in order to use it, we have to send it the number of decimal places we want. So whatever that value is, dot toFixed, and then we send it how many decimal places. So if we're using money or currency in the United States, we need 2 decimal places. So for example, here I've got a variable total and it's got 3. I could say toFixed with 0 and it's going to round 2.8 to 3. If I'm going to fix it with 1 decimal place, 3 rounds to 8, so 2.8. If I want 2, it's going to 3 will round to a 4 because there's a 5 after it, so 2.84. We can format values using local strings, and we can format dates or numbers with a few different options. We can say value to local string wherever we are, the locale and the options. So this way we can actually change it for different countries and various different things. So let's take a look at this. Here, we're just going to apply local settings from the user's computer. So whatever the user's computer is set to, that's what we're going to use. So say my total is a number with 3 decimal points. I can say total.toLocale string returns 14, 281 period 487. Oh, 478. Sorry, dyslexia. If we want to take that number and we want to format it as a US currency, I then say, remember, locale and some options. So where's my locale? English, US. Okay. My options are that I want the style to be currency. I want the currency to be in US dollars. So something else cool that happens with that is it also puts that $sign directly in front of the value. So whatever you have listed as your local for currency, that's what it's going to use here. But here you're forcing it to go to a US currency. So that's the big difference. Remember, we took a look at this and we had some wonky numbers, right? Here, we just had a 0. There were no $signs, and we had some extra numbers after the decimal point for tax and total. If I add to my code that to local string, we had model cost dot value equals model cost. So what we added is the dot to locale string. I'm going to send it, I want US English, I want currency in US dollars. That right there from the dot to the end was pasted under plan cost, under value, under tax, and under total cost. So when I reload this web page, it then makes it all nice and pretty as currency. So it is actually a very nice, easy way for programming to switch and format common things like currency, times, dates, things like that. This is a great segue into making your website international friendly. So we are able to create websites that are going to support international conventions. In order to do that, we want to avoid images that contain text. Your text is not going to be able to be translated from one language to another if it is already embedded into your image. We want to make our layout flexible. We want to optimize your site for international searches. We can do that by adding some other languages into some of our text or some of our hidden text, and that will make it accessible to other countries. We can also add currency conversion features. So say I had the website I had before, I could add a button that says change it to euros, and I could create a method which would just change and format everything from US dollars to a euro. Another thing to keep in mind is cultural differences. The big example that I use for cultural differences is that certain countries find certain numbers lucky and unlucky. And you need to kind of be aware of that. We had a customer one time in a foreign country where their number 7 is unlucky. Well, we did not want to put the number 7 in any of our photos or our presentations. So say we were doing an example of airline seating, we didn't want to give them row 7. Just as in the United States, 13 is considered unlucky, so you would not want to say you are on the 13th floor of a hotel. Most hotels in the US, I don't know if you've noticed, do not even have a floor 13 because it's that unlucky. So something that is that small could actually make or break your website when you're talking about becoming international friendly. Form and element event handlers. We've talked about some of these. We have on blur, and that is the element that has lost focus. We've got on change, so if something has changed. On focus, so it receives focus. On input is when the user has put in input. On invalid, so is the element value valid or not. On reset, on search, select, and on submit. Here we've got our lovely website back, and what we're going to do here is we are going to run the calc order function when any order form element changes the value. So anytime I change this pull down, I change the quantity, or I change this radio button, it's going to update that calculation automatically. So in order to do that, after in my window load function here, I'm going to add the event listener to all of the elements of the form. So order form.elements.length, I'm going through each element. For each element, I want to add the event listener on change. And when it changes, I want to call that calc order function that we've already written. So we know it works because we've already tested it. Now I'm just adding the performance of that function anytime any element in this form changes. You can add hidden fields to your JavaScript, which will be used by the server to process a web form, and your user will have no idea that it's even there. So sample HTML for hidden fields is you have an input type, which is hidden. Your name, you can give it a name. Your ID, you can give it an ID name, and then your name, you can give it a model name. So some sample code. order form elements, model name value equals options.text. Okay, so that's going to store the text of the selected option in a list. So again, we're putting information into that element and we're associating it with that element without really the user needing to know that it's there. A query string is something that we call a long text string containing field names and values from a web form. So here, again, let's take a look. We are going to store the text of the label associated with the checked option in a set of option buttons. So we're taking the text and we are giving it here. We've got the query selector. That's where we do it the shorthand way. And then here we've got set the value equal to the labels.text content. So we're storing that text in a hidden field so that your user doesn't really see it, but then we're going to take it and display it to the user later. The big difference is that it's associating it with that element. So form submission, actions within the browser when a submit button, and it is very specific. A submit button has an attribute type of submit. Okay, it's a very specific button, has a specific purpose. So once you do activate a submit button, your field values are going to be looked at for valid or invalid data. If everything's valid, so you have no invalid data, you're going to do a submit event. If no errors occur in the form submission, a request is sent to the server or whoever's handling the form data. So using your submit event, so we can just say form.submit method, and that is going to submit a form without validating data or firing the submit event of the form object. We can also reset a form, which will take it back to the original appearance without making any changes. We can do that by saying form.reset. Okay, that is, like I said, that's going to take it back to the original default values, if any. It'll clear it if that's what you would like. The reset is good for if you add like a clear button. We can validate data with our JavaScript. Now, validation is basically checking your data to see if it is correct and usable. We can do it either on the client side or the server side. If we do it on the client side, it is done on your client's computer. The server side is handled by the web server. We do have browser-based validation, and that is derived from HTML attributes to restrict what data the user can and can't enter using some rules. So, for example, if I ask for a phone number and the user starts to enter in letters, that would be an invalid. So sample HTML code to mark a field as required. So input name, card name, ID, card name, required type equals text. Okay, that's going to mark it as a required field that needs to accept text. So the big key element here is the word required. So it will always check to make sure that that field has something in it. Here under CSS, we've got some different ways of indicating that it's invalid data. Sometimes websites will change it to like a red font, or the background of the text box will turn red, or something so that it brings your eye to the portion of the form that you have filled out incorrectly. So for here, input, if my input is valid, I'm going to change the background color to a more noticeable color for the user's eye to see. For example, here, the text box is going to change to a background red color. So here I've got some text boxes. I've marked them as required. So here it has the little asterisk next to it. So the name, the credit card type, the number, expiration date, and CVC. You can see here I've put that the asterisk is a required type, and there's my submit button. Remember, we're working with that different button. Here, if an invalid field is found, I can do a window alert saying, please fill out that field. It's generated by the browser because I've set it as required. If I leave it blank, it's going to turn it pink, and the browser itself is going to give me the error message. So in this case, the JavaScript is doing one error, which is turning it red, and then the browser is actually assisting you by giving you the error box. You can also add your own with the window alert. No big deal. If you leave the validation to your browser, there are some limitations. Your error messages are going to be generic. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's not helpful. Your validation tests are going to be based on a single field value, and your tests are going to be limited to data field entries. These tests are not going to be checked for calculated items or functions that you may have created. We do have something called a constraint validation API, and that's going to be properties and methods that are built into JavaScript that are used to supplement what our browser gives us for validation. So we have a valid property, which is going to return true if it contains data. We've got a check validity, which is going to return true for valid data and false for invalid data. If we have invalid data, it's actually going to alert an invalid event. And so an invalid event is going to be what's going to occur whenever your browser encounters a value that doesn't match what you have specified as the rules. Again, I'll go back to, say we do a zip code. A zip code in the US is numeric. If there is an alphanumeric put in there, it will create an invalid event. We can explore the validity state object. And what that's going to do is that's going to store information about what caused that invalid data event. And we can reference it by saying whatever the element is, dot validity. If we want to check whether a field is invalid due to a specific state, we can also do that. So we can say the element dot validity dot whatever state we're looking for. What do I mean when I say state? Well, is the value missing? Is it too long? Is it not the correct format? Things like that. We can also create custom validation messages. So they are associated with your elements. So I can say element set custom validity and then send it the message I want to say. It can be used within an if block, if else block, and it's going to display a custom message for a given invalid state or an empty string for a valid state. So I can say if validity.valid state is too long, I can set a message saying your input is too long. I can also say element.validity.value missing, and then I can create a custom message displaying to the user saying you've missed a value. You can see how making these custom validation messages are going to be more helpful to the user, because remember, the browser stays generic. There's something wrong. You're missing something. These custom ones will bring your user back and help them correct their own mistakes. Here I've got a validate name. So this function is going to check to see if the owner's name is entered on the card. So let card name equal get element by ID. So card name is now my element. I'm checking the validity. So card name dot validity dot value missing. So that is testing if that required value is missing from the card field. If it is missing, I'm going to set a pop-up message that says enter your name as it appears on the card. Okay, so that's going to be my error message to the user. What it's saying is the card name is blank, so instead of just saying you missed an input field, it's telling you exactly what input field you missed. If the message is valid, we have no pop-up, so we just set it equal to blank. Invalid data is important because our users are going to try and put everything into whatever. So responding to invalid data using event handlers or event listeners is very important. So for the change event of an input control, that's going to check your validity of data as the user enters it. If you wait for a click, it's going to do the validity when something is clicked, say, the submit button. So you can also implement when you check the validity based on your event handler or your event listener. You can validate data with pattern matching. So this again goes back to the numeric, alphanumeric. Text content can be validated against a regular expression. So concise code describing the general pattern and content of characters within a text string. So this is useful for numerics with specific patterns, such as credit card numbers. In the United States, we have social security numbers. Phone numbers also have specific patterns. So we can do a pattern matching. We can also validate a selection list. So if the user is going to change from the dummy option to a valid selection, you must instruct the browser to declare the field invalid if the dummy options index is left selected. So for example, the default for a pull down is a blank and you want that user to select an option. You then have to tell the code that the blank, even though it is in my list, is an invalid option. Here we've got some code. So here we're going to add an event listener on click. When I click the submit button, it's going to validate name. Down here, I can check if a credit card's been selected. So remember, the credit card was a radio button, option button, where it said Visa, MasterCard, things like that. Let card equal elements.credit. The validity is missing. If it's missing, you give that custom error message that says select your credit card. Up here, we've got check if the credit card number is valid. So what this is going to do is this is going to give a pattern matching. So here, I'm going to test whether it's blank. So if it's missing, it's going to say to the user, enter your card number. You haven't entered in anything. Otherwise, if there is a pattern mismatch, so a credit card has 16 digits. If my user puts in 4 digits, it is going to be a pattern mismatch and it's going to say enter a valid card number. Otherwise, it's going to be okay and it's just not going to put a pop-up message. So for the credit card, I'm doing 2 different validations within this function within my if and if else. I'm doing value missing, so if there's no value in it at all, and then I'm doing the pattern matching. Down here, I've got the expiration date, which is a month and a year. That is a pull down that has a default value that we don't want to look at. So I'm getting my expiration month. If the selected index is at the top, if it's the very first one, that is my default. If it is set at, if the selected one is the very first one, I'm going to tell them select an expiration month. It means they have not changed from the default, which is not actually a month. It's just a dummy value. The same thing happens for a year. There's a dummy value for the year, which is at the very top of the selected index at 0. So if my index is at 0, that means my user has not changed it and they need to go ahead and select an expiration year. Testing a field against a regular expression. So this is where we can determine some pattern matching. So here we've got my expression and test and then the text to test. So for example, let the CVC code, which in the United States is a specific code on a credit card, which is a 3-digit number. So here I'm going to say get element by ID, CVC is valid. Here is my regular expression. It is enclosed within the slashes. I'm going to do a dot test and I'm going to send it that value. Let's take a look at this code though. So here I'm just retrieving the element and what was entered in by the user. I'm going to dive into my if statement, taking it line by line. So the first one is the value missing. There's nothing there. So enter in a credit card number. Here, if the card is an American Express, and I've not entered in a 4-digit number, it's going to tell me to enter in a 4-digit number. On American Express, the CVC is a 4. On most other major credit cards, it is 3. If it's not an Amex and it is not a 3-digit number, it's going to give a complaint to the user and say, enter a 3-digit number. If it matches any of this stuff and it's good to go, it's just going to set the validity to blank and the CVC number is considered valid. We can create custom checks. So a checksum algorithm is an algorithm that is going to sum a number of digits in a specific way, and it's going to check whether that sum satisfies specific mathematical conditions. Sometimes you may have seen when you download, it will give you a checksum to make sure that you have gotten the entire download, that your download is correct, that it hasn't been messed with, things like that. There is a specific algorithm out there that will calculate the sum of the digits in a credit card number after doubling every other digit, going backwards from the end of the number for a legitimate card number. And the sum is always going to be a multiple of 10. So this is going to go in our credit card. A function that performs the calculation for a checksum algorithm can be used as a custom validity check. So if I look down here, and the Loon algorithm actually is something that we can look at in JavaScript, and it is already a built-in method. So if the credit card number fails the Loon algorithm, then that means that it is not a legitimate card number. Okay, so I add into my validation of the number the addition of this Loon algorithm, and that allows me to decide whether it's a valid number or not. You can also disable your browser validation tools and give it a custom validation framework that you create yourself. In order to do that, you say form equals no validate equals true. Alternatively, you can add an event listener to run an anonymous function that calls prevent default when it hears an invalid event. And what that's going to do is that's going to prevent the default browser validation tool and force it to go to the custom one. Your event object is the object associated with the event, which is captured by the script. Here we've got some code, which is just kind of pseudocode, but it's going to show you the syntax of what we want to do, because you can disable the built-in validation tools and then run your own validation tools when a user hits submit. So here on submit, I want you to run my validation. That is going to overwrite the default of using the built-in validation. And then I create a my validation function that is going to, on the event, it's going to prevent the default. So that's what's going to turn off the browser's validation and force it to go to yours. So that I can start my if statement, and I can put my list of ifs and else ifs where I specify what I'm checking in order for the validation to happen. So if the form is valid, that's what happens when it passes. Otherwise, if it doesn't pass validation, what do you want me to do? Now, the big thing about this function for the validation that overwrites it, you do want to return a true if the validation passes and a false if it does not pass, because that is what the default does. So we want to basically overwrite the default and give it my own instructions for what I want it to do. A lot of information on validation and using data in JavaScript and in your HTML. We've touched on all of these great topics. I'm not going to read them out to you again because you can see them for yourself. But this does conclude the JavaScript portion of this course and this video. So can't wait to get started with you on our next language in our next video.